Welcome to the Chamber of Medford and Jackson County's virtual forum. Today's program is sponsored by U.S. Bank and brought to you by our season sponsor, the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians. I'm Brian Young, District Manager and Vice President for U.S. Bank, and I'll be emceeing today's program. Also with us, we have Eric Torrey, Commercial and Business Banking Team Manager at U.S. Bank, who will be introducing our keynote speaker. Rob Engstrom, the Chief Political Strategist for the American Bankers Association and CEO of Wolf Street Partners. Thank you both for being here today. I'd now like to take the time to thank the forum sponsors who help us put on these programs. We appreciate each of you for your continued support. The Chamber is grateful to bring everyone together on these topics that are important to our business community. Just as we do for every virtual forum, I just want to remind you of how the program will work. If you've attended one of these online before, you likely already know this, but for those of you who are new, I'd like to explain a few things. The first thing you may have noticed is that you're not on screen and you don't have video or microphone capabilities. You are in attendee mode. There is a Q&A feature of the webinar. At the bottom of your screen, you should see an icon with Q&A on it. You'll be able to type in your question for the panelists if you want to use that feature. I'll be reading through your questions and asking a few of them at the end of the presentation to our speakers. You know, as we prepare for comments from Rob this morning, I'm thinking about the momentum that we have coming into January and coming into a new year, and I know how excited each of us were to push 2020 aside and move forward with some new hope and vision for the future. And I want to take a moment to just embrace those challenges that we all went through in 2020 and recognize the strength that it's given us to uniquely prepare to overcome challenges that we may have in the future. And certainly in our market, with everything that we went through, if we haven't shown yet that determination to overcome, I don't know what will prove that, as we've seen so much from the rebuilding of our neighboring communities who were ravaged by fires late in the summer, as well as the pulling together of businesses to survive during the pandemic. We should each be proud of the work we've done throughout last year. You know, I was thinking about how some of the effects of the last year have changed business, and certainly one of the things that we've all seen is how preferences are changing. More and more of our business is coming through digital channels, you know, through, especially for restaurants, through Grubhubs and DoorDash and all of these online ordering companies. But the portals of which clients see into our businesses are expanding even more each day as the familiarity with these tools and resources become more prevalent in the everyday lives of our customers. And so I thought I'd share the message of how important it is for us to be aware of that. And as we start to think about this year, it's a great time right now to revisit those business plans and ensure that our business plan is considerate of this new avenue that we have to engage with clients and to build our brands and to build our businesses. Certainly, I can say from the seat of U.S. Bank that we continue to see record numbers of clients using our digital tools. And we just recently rolled out a tool that allows for us to actually remotely work together with clients using their mobile app on their phone with one of our local bankers from an office. It's a function called Co-Browse, and someone can call into the bank, ask questions, and we can view the same things they view on their desktop. And so having access to these tools is something that differentiates U.S. Bank, but also at the same time, it's something that I think each of us as business owners can be considerate of moving into the new year when it comes to how we can continue to drive that focus and stay engaged with our clients as we find out what the new world of business will look like post-pandemic. Now, last comment that I wanted to share is a moment of pride for U.S. Bank, as we're incredibly gracious to the community in Southern Oregon, as we were a leader of the PPP funding as we went through round one, and we're eagerly preparing for a second round of that funding. As many of you know, developing an entire platform for a program like that can be challenging no matter what scale you're on. and it didn't come without several internal, pain points for sure. But we're proud to be a player in our community, and we're so proud of the work that we've been able to do to help our small businesses stay as healthy and vibrant as they can as we weather this storm. So with that, I'm pleased to be here and proud to be representing U.S. Bank on the call today, and I'll be back at the end of the call with some closing comments. But now I'd like to pass the mic over to Eric Torrey to introduce today's speaker.
Thanks, Brian. Really excited to introduce our speakers today. I think there's going to be some excellent content. As the American Bankers Association's Chief Political Strategist, Rob Engstrom leads ABA's political engagement operations. Rob's also the co-founder of Wolf Street Partners, which is a strategic advocacy firm that allows them to provide political direction to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce by serving as a senior advisor. Rob has also served in a variety of capacities at the U.S. Chamber since 2002, most recently as a senior vice president and national political director, and served as the chief liaison to nearly 2,000 state and local chambers of commerce. Rob has extensive campaign experience and was recognized by Campaigns and Elections magazine as one of the top 50 influencers of the 2014 election. Rob resides in Alexandria, Virginia, and is a graduate of Baylor University. Rob, thank you again for being here with us today, and looking forward to the content.
Eric, thank you so much, and Brian, and thanks to U.S. Bank for your partnership, your sponsorship, and it's great to see our friends at U.S. Bank on this call, and also to have the honor and privilege to work with you on a very regular basis as I work with the American Bankers Association, and also your real stewardship and partnership with the chambers of commerce across the country. So thank you to you, to both of you, and to your bank, and also to the other sponsors who helped make this possible. I'm grateful for the chance to be with you. I only wish I could be with you in person again. I had the honor to travel to Medford and visit with my dear friend Brad Hicks back in the 2014 election primary for Mr. Walden, where we were able to partner together. And I really want to appreciate my friendship with Brad. He's been a friend and a mentor for almost 20 years that I've been associated with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He serves on and has for a number of years, one of the longest serving members of the U.S. Chambers Committee of 100. These are the top 100 chambers of commerce from across the country who help make the U.S. Chamber better, but who also represent the best of the American free enterprise system. And so I'm honored and grateful to be with you virtually. And again, can't wait to do so in person. It is a beautiful part of the state, but also of America. And I appreciate what you do every day to help defend free enterprise. So thank you. Let me lead with that, but then also transition into trying to attempt to unpack the election that apparently will never end with the most recent results last Tuesday and into actually Friday in my home state of Georgia, with two United States Senate runoffs that did ultimately tip the balance of power in the U.S. Senate. But let me first try to put this election into some context. And I also, Eric and Brian and Brad and Lydia, want to make sure to reserve plenty of time for question and answer. So I'll be succinct in terms of my remarks and leave plenty of time for discussion in that particular regard. So let me first try and put this election in context. And the best measure that I've been able to find to this point is 1982 National Journal came out with a survey that rated members of Congress in the House and the Senate, Democrats and Republicans, on the issues that matter most to the American business community, to chambers of commerce of all sizes across the country. Back in 1982, in President Reagan's first term, 90% of the members of the House and also of the Senate were rated within 10 percentage points of a governing middle on issues that matter to the American business community, meaning that Democrats from the West, Democrats from my home state of Georgia, were sometimes rated as more conservative on business issues, than perhaps some Republicans from the Northeast, as an example. That 90% mass in the middle allowed President Reagan at the time, Tip O'Neill, to come together on issues that matter to jobs and also to the economy and to chambers of commerce across the country. To fast forward to today, and they haven't come out with the most recent analysis, but we're left with, before this past election, literally one member of the U.S. Senate who's within 10 percentage points of that governing middle, and 13 members of the House of Representatives where the same thing is true. So we've seen a deviation in terms of this so-called, four-letter word now, compromise. We've seen members of the Republican Party across the country move more fully to the right. We've seen Democrats move more fully to the left. There are about only 40 districts in the House of Representatives that are still competitive in November are redder. The blue districts are bluer. So the concept of election day is, in my opinion, antiquated. We now have primary elections that fundamentally determine what most congressional members of Congress look like in terms of those particular districts. Obviously, we're in the middle of a redistricting process yet again. I'm going to come back to that towards the end of my remarks, but we've seen, in my judgment, in my estimation, a protracted period of disruption in our politics that did not begin in 2020. You can go back to the Florida recount in 2000. I spent 5 weeks in 6 different counties measuring the vote, helping to represent at that time in a former life, now former President Bush's campaign. Spent time in 2008 in the recount in Norm Coleman, Minnesota, and against Al Franken, who ultimately was able to win that election during the recount. 2006, 2008, wave elections for the Democratic Party. Partially in response to the Iraq War and the economy at that time, wave election 2010 for the Republican Party. And then we've had a series of asymmetrical political elections since that time, resulting in the current circumstance. Let me also pause and reflect on the actions of some of our fellow citizens. Last week, I was shocked and appalled at the behavior to be gentle with the things that I saw, that we all witnessed, that we had personal responses to, personal reactions to see the Capitol attacked was more than shocking, more than appalling in terms of what's occurred. I note that in the last 30 minutes, apparently the National Guard, there are going to be 10,000 National Guard troops. Apparently, I haven't read the full article, so don't quote me on it, but allegedly 10,000 National Guard troops that have been called up in advance of a protest in Washington this coming Sunday, and also in advance of the inauguration, as well as in state capitals across the country. So I do want to express my obvious concern and sympathy to those who've been impacted, the 5 people who've perished in this circumstance. I hope that we are now moving past that, and I hope that we obviously don't have another event that mimics what we all just experienced. But it is a symptom, in my opinion, of a larger narrative that I just tried to attempted to describe, which is a polarization in our politics that goes far beyond party affiliation. It goes into the tenets and the themes that do represent our democratic system, and obviously the role that chambers of commerce can play in helping to instill certainty and instill confidence go a long way to turning the page. Even if we may disagree on policy, it's important that we respect deeply the process and members of both parties who are trying to do the right thing. So this protracted period of disruption, this increase in the acrimony in primaries in both the Democratic Party and also the Republican Party has led us to where we are right now. So let me attempt to unpack the presidential election and then go to the Senate, House, talk about redistricting briefly. And then Eric and Brian want to make sure to leave time, as I mentioned, for Q&A. So essentially the last 25 years or so, the presidential map as it relates to the states that matter most to gain a majority in the Electoral College has essentially been fairly static. There are about 18 states that ultimately determine which way the Electoral College goes. So states like California, predetermined. States like Texas, less so now, essentially predetermined. Illinois, New York are going to go for the Democrats. Arkansas is going to go for the Republicans post-President Clinton. We essentially have 18 states that have been pretty well the battleground firewalls for both political parties, but then there's essentially this swing set of states that determine the outcome. What's notable this cycle is states like Arizona in the West, states like my home state of Georgia, flipped to be blue at the presidential level. That hasn't happened in Georgia since 1992. The state has changed. As the population moves from north and east to south and to the west, that not only changes the state legislative districts, the congressional districts, but it obviously, also has impacts on the Electoral College. So essentially every 10 years, a pretty big, pretty healthy sized state moves south and west as it relates to which party will benefit from that from that movement. And so the question fundamentally, and this won't be answered on this Zoom call, it'll occur over years, but when people move from New York or Illinois or from Pennsylvania or from Ohio to Arizona, Georgia, Texas, or Nevada, or Florida, do they bring their voting patterns with them, or do they assimilate into the state in which they have decided to move or now reside? And I think that depends on income. It depends on their circumstance, their where they are in their life. But that is changing and always does every 10 years. But I think it's particularly acute in this particular election. So states like Arizona and Georgia mattered a bunch. The president pinned his hopes on winning at least one of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, states that traditionally all of them have gone for Democrats for the recent history, with the exception of Wisconsin for President Bush in 2004. Was able to secure a victory in the state of America. I'm sorry, I dipped out for a moment there. I hope you can still hear me. I was suggesting that American politics used to be linear, with Republicans here, Democrats here, and now it's more like a horseshoe, where on issues like trade, Bernie Sanders and this current president share more commonality than most. And so the paradigm is shifting in terms of where the parties align on the issues. And that makes it more difficult, not easier, on the complicated issues that chambers of commerce deal with. The issues that in the many, many years that I've spent with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, when we survey the 1,600 state and local chambers on the issues that matter most, chambers of all sizes in all 50 states, the number one issue and the number two issue are always the same things. They have been since I've been there since 2002. And that is, first, the talent pipeline, education reform. How do we find the workforce of tomorrow? And then infrastructure, roads, bridges, but yes, also broadband and ports and anything that represents the tabletop of the American economy. Those issues also don't lend themselves neatly to a 30-second television ad, nor do they also, neither of them reside with one political party. And that's why I think the thing that's lacking, one of the things that's lacking most in our current political narrative, our current political debate, is an ability to recognize and value trusted messengers and or validators. And I think that's where chambers of commerce have a unique role to play, because they are respected, you are respected by members of both political parties, independents in every corner of this country, and certainly in Jackson County, and also as part of that in the state of Oregon, and also in your role as having a representative on the Chamber of Commerce's Committee of 100 to help shape national issues and shape a national approach. So I think the role of the chambers, we all do two things at Chambers of Commerce. We advocate and we convene. We're doing both of those things today. And I think that role has never been more important, at least in the 22 years that I've been working in the states with Chambers of Commerce, and also on behalf of people that support our issues. So the presidential race, I think the outcome met the polling. Most folks in the polling industry actually got it right in terms of the ultimate outcome at the presidential level, very different than 2016, both in the primary and then obviously in the outcome in the general election. But those Rust Belt states that the president wasn't able to win a single one of really, really hampered his efforts. He had to have one in terms of the electoral college map. So looking forward in the next 2 and 4 years respectively, it will be interesting to see whether Georgia and Arizona were anomalies, and or whether it's a permanent realignment as it relates to the electoral college. A moment on the Senate. Conventional wisdom, as it was in 2016 as well, is that, well, if Trump's on the ballot, then certainly the Republicans are going to lose the Senate in 2016. And then also in this particular cycle, Republicans exceeded expectations in states like Maine, in states like North Carolina, in states like Iowa as well, where they were able to hold the line and draw distinctions from their own state, their own issues, their own race, and the top of the ticket. My home state of Georgia, then also, surprised people, a lot of people, in terms of the ultimate outcome there. The president being in an open debate, discussion, conflict with the Republican governor, with the Republican Secretary of State, challenging the outcome of the presidential race, muted Republican turnout in the northern part of Atlanta, the suburbs where I grew up in particular, where I still have a lot of family, economic, not even conservatives, but people who vote on economic issues who might have different views on social issues, stayed home. A lot of those districts, including Newt Gingrich's district, my first job out of college on his campaign, that district in parts of Cobb County, North Fulton County, changed dramatically and led to historic turnout from the Democratic Party and both Democratic candidates. And they fundamentally shaped and reshaped and changed the majority in the US Senate, with now Vice President-elect Harris, who will break the tie. For those folks who followed the 2000 election or who were following that very closely and the impacts on the Senate of the United States was also evenly divided at 50-50 following the 2000 election until Republican Senator Jim Jeffords switched to be an independent, giving Democrats the functional majority with his independent switch. So we'll see what it means in terms of a power share. We'll see what it means on big issues like the Green New Deal, Medicare for all, tax reform. I am optimistic and I am bullish with regard to immigration reform, also infrastructure and trade. I think there are issues where Democrats and Republicans have both expressed a willingness to get something done there. But as our sponsors mentioned in the beginning, and I very much appreciate the role of US Bank and the banking sector and chambers of commerce to help get capital out the door and help make sure that our small businesses have the cash they need, the liquidity they need to help protect their employees and help serve their customers. Banks didn't ask for that role, but they stepped up in a historic and patriotic manner to do that. And I think we're in the process of doing that again today and later this week with the guidance from Treasury as well as from the Small Business Administration. So I'm proud of the patriotic role that banks have played through this crisis and will continue to play along with chambers of commerce hand in hand. So the Senate of the United States is now evenly divided. The House finally also surprised a number of people. Conventional wisdom is that Democrats were going to gain a single digit, as many as 12 seats, with a sharp pencil analysis of the districts that were most competitive. In fact, the inverse occurred. The inverse is true. Republicans netted about that number. We're still waiting on 2 seats, 1 seat, debatably 2 seats that are left and still outstanding in Iowa in particular there. So a razor thin majority for the Democrats in the House, the most razor thin majority with Vice President now elect Harris breaking the tie in the Senate. And so a lot of this activity that we're going to, I think, deal with moving forward will be in fact in the regulatory agencies, with the EPA on energy and the environment, the Interior, Department of Labor on labor policy, obviously healthcare policy front and center, as well as financial services and banking issues that we've discussed as well. So that means that the courts will play an outsized role with the number of appointments that this president has made, not just with the US Supreme Court, but also helping to remake the federal judiciary, and also state courts obviously will play a role there as well. So that is, again, an asymmetrical election. I think voters in the polling and the focus groups that I've looked at in a number of states really and truly do want certainty. They do want a check and a balance. Most Americans aren't partisan. They really want to look out for their states and districts. They might have an inclination, but there is a disruption in our politics, again, a protracted period of disruption. And then let me maybe perhaps finally end on redistricting. This obviously occurs every decade. The last analysis that I saw talking with folks from the census is that the maps ultimately have to be drawn. The people have to be counted. They have been counted. The maps are drawn. Then for a number of states, they have to go to the Department of Justice to get final clearance, particularly in a number of southern states as well. The last estimate I saw is that timeline has slipped at least 3 months till the end of August. I suspect it's possible it could slip into the fall. That has a dramatic impact on candidate recruitment at the state level across our country for the states impacted, but also for candidate recruitment for the Congress, particularly when you think about how narrowly divided this particular Congress is. having candidates or prospective candidates in this case not know what districts they're going to run in basically cuts the election in half. So whereas candidates typically would be out running right now or beginning to circulate and generate support for their prospective candidates, forming exploratory committees, meeting with chambers of commerce. That is happening, but it's happening with a big question mark because candidates don't ultimately know where the lines are going to go. Republicans did make gains at the state level in really important state legislatures that will help determine what the lines look like. But again, these are estimates. Where does the population go? Which states lose seats? Which states gain seats? Some of it's intuitive. Some of it's not yet determined based on what the lines ultimately are, not to mention the lawsuits that invariably ensue following the lines being drawn in that regard. 2022, not to get ahead of ourselves, we have 667 days, last I checked. But the map in the Senate, talked about the House with redistricting there, but the Senate map is essentially very close to what it was this time. Republicans, again, are on defense, and they're on defense in very expensive and competitive seats. Let me just mention a handful to give you a flavor for what 2022 looks like. Republicans have open seats in North Carolina, true swing purple seat. In this instance, Mr. Burr, the senator, head of Senate Intelligence, is going to step down, is not going to run again. He's going to retire. Mr. Toomey in Pennsylvania, the same is true. This is a state the president won the first time, as we mentioned before, lost the second time. Super expensive nation state in terms of how expensive these races were. When Mr. Toomey ran for re-election in 2016, it was the most expensive Senate race in the history of our nation. And so those are two open states in a state like Pennsylvania that leans blue. North Carolina, a state that is purple. Mr. Portman, incredibly thoughtful, gifted, talented legislator, former head of the OMB under Mr. Bush, is up for re-election. Mr. Rubio in Florida, always a competitive state, always a competitive seat. Florida is certainly on the ballot. Also, one of the Georgia seats, because it was a special election, Mr. Warnock, Senator-elect seat, is up again in 2 years to fulfill the full term of Mr. Isaacson, who decided to retire, resign early there. So we'll have another seat in Georgia. We'll also have another seat in Arizona, which also was a special election in that regard as well. We can talk about Alabama, Kansas, Wisconsin. I can go through the rest of the map. There's other seats also like Alaska with Ms. Murkowski, who's calling on the president to resign. So Alaska will also be competitive. So Republicans have their work cut out for them. On the House side, candidate recruitment is a challenge because of redistricting. And then obviously we have the vast majority of governors who are up, except for 13 of them, who are up this time in 2022 as well, not to mention the legislative contest. So questions, I'm happy to take them. I would just suggest that there's a number of things that we just don't know yet. We don't know what's going to happen this Sunday or with the inauguration. My hope and belief is that we can move into the first 100 days of the next president, Mr. Biden's term, find ways to gain momentum on the issues that chambers of commerce and our members care deeply about, like trade, like immigration, like the talent pipeline, infrastructure. And we'll also have a number of threats that we'll have to deal with, as we always do in any administration. So with that, I will, Eric, Brian, Brad, Lydia, yield to any questions that anybody may have. I always find these things to be more instructive and hopefully helpful if we can have a dialogue. So happy to go deeper on any of those issues, but we'll very much want to respect the time and I appreciate the opportunity to be with you.
Wow, great information, Rob, and thanks for sharing those insights that you have. And I can tell from, one, your passion, but also from your experience that you're a great resource for us to have on the call today. So thank you for being here. At this time, I'd like to open it up for Q&A. If you haven't yet, go ahead and click the Q&A button and type in your questions now. And I'll start with this first question from our friend and chamber president, Brad Hicks. Brad asked, Rob, in all of your years in the process, you've seen plenty rough and tumble politics. Recent events make it difficult to see a path forward. What signs do you see that can give us a little hope that two parties can, quote, knock it off and come together to lead our country?
Thanks, Brad, as always. And I always like to try to equate it to a horse race. So you might pick the 3-horse because that horse has the right odds at the beginning of the race, but you're surprised by a dark horse who hits the post at the right time. I think the thing that we need to get back to, and this is the tradition in our country, think about NAFTA in the 90s, think about tax reform in the 80s, think about trade also in the 80s, as well as welfare reform, more cops on the street, more teachers in the classroom with President Clinton, who took a leadership role there. The old world was we work together, we both are invested in the outcome and the result, and then the election is about bragging about who had the best idea and taking credit for that shared outcome. And there's examples in both political parties, but I would, just as one example, let me give two to be fair and balanced on this. You think about Obamacare. That was a one-party decision. Some Democrats objected to it, but it was a partisan decision. I'm not here to debate the merits of was it a good idea or bad idea. I have my own views on that. But in terms of just the pure political piece of Brad's point about knock it off, is the reality of that political decision was short-term win, but long-term, the Republicans were never going to stop using that as a political weapon. We're 10 years past the decision. We're still litigating that issue. I think the Trump tax cuts as well. I have my own views there as well, but to be fair and straight about it and bipartisan, the same is true where the Democrats will always fight to repeal those tax cuts, in particular because there wasn't the same bipartisan narrative. So my hope is that, and this is historic disruption, this is a once in a lifetime series of events that alone create tremendous uncertainty, but the compounded nature of a global pandemic, the racial tensions across this country and the events that we've all witnessed, on top of what we saw last week, on top of the economy, on top of the foreign policy issues that we're dealing with, if we can't come together right now, I don't know when we will. I always say chambers of commerce and their members are chief optimism officers. So I'm a believer in that horse that's in the middle of the pack, that's slow and steady, that understands how to run the race. And I think that that's how we get there. I am a believer in those 3 or 4 issues that I outlined, that there is a willingness to get that done. I think that the American people's patience is running out. That's very evident, in my opinion, based on what's been occurring for the last, and it's well more than a year. That's why I wanted to attempt, Brian, to try to put this into context and say this isn't just about a pandemic or just about what's been occurring for the last 10 and maybe we all need a bourbon in the intervening time to help us out, to use a Kentucky Derby analogy there, but I think that bipartisan muscle memory that could be developed, I think, is the antidote that we need. If candidates know that the center of gravity is with compromise in a substantive way, not just a talking point, I think that that's how we begin to change that parallel. But I go back to what I said in the beginning about a third of the way through, which is who are the validators? Who are people, who are the people that we can trust to give us those facts to make those determinations, and who are the statesmen and stateswomen that can help us guide us through that race.
Thanks for that, Rob. So our next question revolves around the appointment of Janet Yellen potentially becoming the Treasury Secretary, and thoughts on her history with the Federal Reserve and how that could play out.
You're asking the political man to have a view on policy, and that's always very, very dangerous. So I won't swerve out of my lane, but what I will say is that discussing this topic with a number of members and colleagues, this is a very solid pick. This is something that gives, I think, the markets confidence. She's a very serious, thoughtful person who has deep respect on both sides of the aisle, and I think will give confidence to the markets. And I think it's an astute and shrewd pick by the incoming president that sends a signal that he is serious about governing. And if you haven't read the book, What It Takes by Richard Ben Cramer, this is a book that is a distillation of the 1996 primary. It's a thick book. It might be a doorstop, but it really does do, I think, a brilliant, it's written a long time ago, but it is a brilliant, in my opinion, distillation of all of the Democratic candidates and then also the Republican candidates. It doesn't take a point of view, but Mr. Biden's personal story that we all know, I always knew at a 50,000 foot level, but when you really read through his personal story and his political history, in my opinion, it's moving and it's powerful. And he is someone that believes in the institutions of government. And he does have substantive relationships on both sides of the aisle. And I believe he will be a calming influence. I think that this pick for Treasury is an example of that.
Great job navigating that one.
Thank you. I listened to Brad.
So we have a question more market related, and the question is the stock market in a melt up right now? And certainly I watched some of these things and I got some thoughts, but I don't know, Rob, if you have thoughts on that.
So I was just looking up the stocks. I looked earlier, we're down 85 points right now. But look, the market has been amazingly resilient throughout this crisis. And I am by no means, so let me caveat this and provide all the appropriate disclaimers. I am not an expert on financial policy nor the stock market, but I'm really good at listening to the smart people that are. I think the market has been incredibly resilient throughout this period. If you look at the trajectory, the trend of where the market has been and where the market has gone. But I think the question that a lot of people are asking, voters are asking, is what does that mean for me if I'm not in the market? And then how do I get into the market? And then what does that mean for housing, values, but also what does it mean as people are? There's anecdotal and I would argue some substantive evidence of people moving from metropolitan areas into more rural parts of our country. I'm joining you from Orange, Virginia, which is about 85 miles outside of Washington, D.C. I've been here since March. We have a small family home here, a town of 6,000 people. And so I've spent my time here looking at this pandemic from a very different perspective than I would if I was in Washington, D.C. And so that's sort of been my, except for 2 nights, I think 2 nights, that's kind of where I've been. So I say that to say, I think the markets have been resilient. The markets are looking for one thing. It's not one party or the other. They're looking for certainty and confidence so that we can plan, because we, chambers of commerce, our respective membership, we make decisions in quarters and years, not in days and in weeks. And I think having confidence, the stock market may not agree with every policy decision or political election, having confidence in certainty in terms of what the markets are likely to do. It's what I have my dad's voice in my ear. What he used to say to my sister and I growing up all the time was, you can deal with good news, you can deal with bad news, you can plan around it, but you can't deal with uncertainty. We've gone through a protracted period of uncertainty. I use the word disruption. In my mind, they're similar, if not very similar. And so I think the markets are looking for certainty. And even if that means it's against some of the policy decisions that they would prefer, I think we're in a strong position in that regard. What we have to watch out for, of course, is what do the next rescue packages look like and what's that impact on perhaps inflation?
Yeah, great comments. And I couldn't agree more. I know that the levers of the government that they're able to use in order to create that stability, while sometimes come with a lot of questions, they do provide that necessary feeling of safety and some comfort to the people. And I think the markets tend to show that, as we've seen from the announcements of stimulus packages and these business funding plans. We typically see a sharp, immediate impact to the markets to correspond.
Well, our friends at US Bank are much better positioned to answer that question than I am.
Thanks for that, Rob. Our next question.
Thank you for the question.
Our next question says, you referenced this briefly. Frank Luntz has said his industry of polling could be history after this election cycle. You mentioned that the thought of election day might be antiquated. Any thoughts about what the future might hold for polling, elections, voting?
Brilliant question. And, I think, there's a misnomer, and I'm not suggesting that it's implicit in the question at all. I'm suggesting it's a totally separate conversation that I had this summer, which is that, there was a debate that I got into with some friendly colleagues about, is polling intended to be predictive or not predictive? And I think there's a lot of folks on cable news that believe polling is intended to be predictive. And having worked very closely with pollsters in both parties for a number of years, it's not. It is intended to be a snapshot in time based on assumptions. So the biggest variable that we have, because of the disruption that permeates our politics, there's two big problems. It's very, very, very difficult to ascertain who's going to turn out, because you have to define turnout. Back to the point about election day or election year. So turnout, think about the fact that people can vote early, quite literally, in September, the third week of September, for president of the US, and also state races and other federal races, before the first presidential debate even occurs. So the idea that election day, the old world was everybody votes on election day, or mostly on election day, except for states like Oregon, Washington, other states that vote by mail, Colorado, mainly in the West. So the idea, we don't have enough data in some states to know what early voting looks like before we even get to a global pandemic where people who otherwise would never vote early. Thinking about the fact that our more mature, seasoned citizens tend to vote on election day. This cycle, a number of them either didn't vote at all or they voted via mail. So polling is really a set of assumptions based on what we believe, or the pollsters in this instance, this question, believe turnout is going to look like. It's not intended to be predictive for what may happen 2 months, 2 weeks, or 2 days from now. So that's, I think, a misnomer that's just substantive in terms of the assumptions and the variables that pollsters tend to put into their equation. The second part is polling is just operationally, sorry, Brian, to jump in the weeds. I hope this is responsive to the question, but polling is incredibly expensive. You have to get about 40% of the sample to be cell phones. That's expensive to buy the list, to find people on cell phones. My cell phone is 202. I don't live in Washington, D.C. My wife's cell phone, she's from El Salvador originally. Her cell phone is 850, where she went to grad school down in Florida at Florida State. Her cell phone is 850. She lives in Virginia. So finding and piecing together and appending that voter universe to determine, so that the pollster can know that we both vote in Northern Virginia, costs a lot of money. The other thing is you've got to get an increasingly robust sample to get enough citizens to lower the margin of error to make sure that you have a representative sample. So I think sometimes on cable news, it turns into sorry to go back to the analogy with the horse race, but we go back to the horse race where it's, this horse versus this horse trying to win the race, where inevitably it's really more about a picture to determine where the race is at that moment in time, not to predict an outcome, but better to inform a political expenditure or to manage expectations with an organization to share. Fundamentally disrupted. Some people are going to online samples as a way to lower the cost. And so that's where the world is going in that regard. But it's very, very difficult in media overall. Sometimes in speeches, what I'll say is, on this very call, and I would suspect that we have people that are far left on some issues, people that are far right on other issues, and others that are that steady horse right down the middle. And the thing is, any of us right now on a substantive issue can pick up our iPhones and find a news source that validates our opinion and on the same issue and find different, or some people say alternative, facts. And that goes back to the point about validators. So polling is disrupted, and I suspect that will take a number of years to figure out what the new paradigm looks like.
Wow, it's almost like you segued that perfectly to our next question. And this next question I love. The question is really revolving around the news and the media silos. And the question reads, do you think social media and the splintering of these news distribution channels is affecting the polarization of political views? I think that's really poignant here, is what we've seen is that the social especially allows you to follow and create silos or echo chambers to further, embolden your political views. what's the prospectus on how that's going to continue to shape the landscape?
Great question again. Thank you for it. And Brian, thanks for conveying it. I think it's, the question is, in my mind, let me perhaps try to rephrase, or at least rephrase it in my answer, which is, do people seek news to validate their own opinions, or do they seek news to inform their opinions? And right now, when I go to Twitter, to say that I'm shocked and appalled at some of the things that I see on Twitter, I couldn't exponentially increase that particular statement. Shocked and appalled doesn't begin to articulate that. Back in 2014 is just one example. And I don't mean that to predate this current administration. I'm just saying, as an example, I use Twitter as a news source. I would get up in the morning very early. I would follow certain news accounts, particularly I've always been blessed to have a state job in a federal town. So I follow state reporters and local reporters. That's sort of what I try to the extent that I bring anything to the table, that's what I try to bring to the table, is what's really going on in Medford, what's really going on in Portland, what's really going on in fill in the blank important place for the business community in the state and also across the country. But I think right now, the paradigm on this question, I think, is elections are typically about persuasion, and passing pieces of legislation are typically about persuasion, convincing people on the merits, or intensity, which means, of course, mobilizing people that already agree with you. I think the media in this country right now, I'm not speaking about local outlets, to be very, very clear. I'm talking about social media, which was the question, is about validation and intensity. The things that I see, the words that are used, the videos that are posted on a number of outlets are deeply offensive to me personally, not in my job, but personally, deeply offensive. They aren't things that I would show my 15-month-old son. They're just beyond the pale. And so I think, what we lack is data. We lack a clean, and there are plenty of news organizations that do a fantastic job that we value and that we watch. But in the social space, I've seen really just, it's a place where anybody can go on the street corner, put a clapboard sign on and yell at the sky. And I don't think that informs the debate. I think, unfortunately, it helps validate and dig people in. There aren't many people on Twitter that I see that are persuadable on political issues. So I think people are going to demand, increasingly people are self-selecting their news. That comes to everything from your television choices in your personal life to your social media choices. But right now social media, in my opinion, is turned into a place where people go to be validated based on what they already believe, rather than to gather data and information. So I'm always on the lookout for news sites that help inform. And so if anybody has suggestions, I would be grateful for that.
Thanks, Rob. I'd like to ask one question personally. So as more of the election started to come out and we started to see the changes in power as the Senate results came out from the runoffs, there was a lot of talk about what this could mean with the balance of power going more to the Democrats. And some of the things that we started hearing were a momentum around a new minimum wage or an increased minimum wage, or some worker protection policies, and a lot of financial policy changes, and certainly more regulation comes as a result of that. For the small business owners who are joining us today, is there anything that is being thrown around, or that was a hot button item that, now that we know the results, you would say this is something that small business owners would be wise to pay closer attention to or create as part of their business planning as they move into 2021? Did we lose Rob?
It's a call. I'm happy to take that as well. Can you hear me?
Got you now.
Can you hear me? Sorry about
I've
that.
got you, Rob.
Of course, it's been fine all day. Sorry about that. I would say a couple of things in that regard, Brian. Thanks for the question. I hope this is responsive to it. The first is that I think the PPP loan program is something that has tremendous bipartisan support. And so making sure those dollars get out the door swiftly. We'll deal with the forgiveness issue, of course, and that's something that matters a lot to small businesses as well as businesses of all sizes. So let's see what the relief package looks like or packages look like as we move ahead. What I would say the second point is that we do have effectively we have one party rule in the sense that Democrats have all the levers, but we have some incredibly thoughtful Democratic legislators that will have a significant voice in whatever the recovery packages look like, but also what minimum wage looks like, what the Green New Deal perhaps legislation will look like or not, Medicare for all, tax reform, infrastructure, trade will look like. I often reference my friend Joe Manchin, the senator from West Virginia, who I worked with very closely when he was a two-term governor, very closely with the local chambers and the state chamber in West Virginia, was communicating with him, texting with him through the holiday season. There are fair-minded Democrats that are very thoughtful on these issues and have been defenders of free enterprise, and they will have an outsized voice to balance partisan inclinations in both political parties. And the election in 2022 has already, even though it's 667 days away, it's already underway as it relates to the Senate. And I think members are mindful of that. And so I'm actually somewhat optimistic that we're going to have a more certain play field here. I don't think that small business owners will agree with everything that comes out of the Biden administration, but I do think that there will be things that are going to be substantive and thoughtful and that small business can support. What I would say is the brand of small businesses and the patriotic nature of the way that you have operated to protect your employees through this crisis with great sacrifice is something that will accrue to the benefit for decades to come. This will be a moment that we all look back to. And we also recognize the role of chambers to be conveners, to share best practices and advice through this crisis. But that's something that I think has even added an additional layer of respect to small businesses, mid-sized companies and larger businesses across this country that I know the American people in every conversation I've been in and polling I've seen beyond polling know that and believe that. And so I'm grateful for the work of businesses of all sizes through this pandemic and as we move ahead.
Great. Thanks, Rob. That does conclude our questions, but I did want to note that we do have some comments out here thanking you for your approach and for the bipartisan way that you've produced the information using your background and your experience to share some perspective with us and from the participants and for me. I appreciate that. Thank you. As we look to close out, I wanted to make a couple of quick comments here that last year I had the pleasure of being able to speak at our chamber forum in January as well. And we were doing the new chamber brand rollout, and Reveal was there presenting to show the new brand rollout. And I said at that time, I'd only been in the Southern Oregon market for just a few short months. And in those few short months, I quickly realized that there was something special here. There's something special in the beauty of the area, but there's also something special that I can't put my finger on, but it binds this community together. And I mentioned it early in the opening comments, but we've seen that power, those binding powers, pull us through some pretty incredible stuff this year. And I want to make sure that we all keep in mind as we talk about some of these fractures in our political system and the divides that we have between one belief or another, or one representative or another, that it's important for us to keep in mind that we are the power of the system as members of our community, as small business owners, as the leaders of our organizations. It's important to keep in mind that much of what happens that impacts us happens at our local level within our city, our counties, and certainly within our states. And so we still have a voice and will continue to have a voice. So don't lose sight through all of the fog of what's happening on the political landscape of what's really most important, which is each of us working together, coming together to grow business in our community and make this the special place that it is and that it has been for us, for our employees, and certainly for the customers and the clients at large in our communities that we serve. I continue to be proud to call Medford home. I absolutely love being here, save all of the fog and the rain that we've been having lately and the lack of a view of any of our beautiful landscape. But I just continue to be proud of this community as I see how you've adapted, how you've maintained, and how you continue to overcome. And so I hope that each of you will leave here today with Rob's information, feeling more empowered that while change is happening and while certainly we've gone through some tumultuous political environments, the best is yet to come. There's a lot of optimism around the vaccine for COVID. There's a lot of optimism on some of the rhetoric dying down and Washington getting back to business. And frankly, in the business world, there's just a lot of optimism from the innovation that's come out of the pandemic that will continue to live with us as we move forward. So with that, Rob, I want to thank you for being here with us. Thanks again for all of the information that you shared. We're lucky to have you. You're a great mind and certainly a great voice for small business and all that you do. So we appreciate you being here. Certainly a timely topic on everyone's mind as we talk through the political landscape, and we just appreciate the time that you've taken to be here.
I'm grateful.
With that, absolutely. I want to thank all of the forum sponsors. Thank you to all of our viewers for attending. We'll see you back here again next month, February 8th, where our sponsor, Regent Blue Cross Blue Shield, will be presenting. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Take care. Have a great week.